Breakup is supposed to be survivable. Cry. You lean on your friends. And one day, the name that once felt like the center of the world barely makes you flinch. That is what almost everyone does. The 10 young women here did something else. They were teenagers, aged 15 to 19. Some honor students. Some the popular girl everyone trusted. One of them the grieving girlfriend who showed up at the hospital to be comforted. And when a relationship ended, or a jealousy took hold, or two people wanted the same person, they decided that someone simply had to be erased. The reasons were almost always small. The results were the opposite of small. The most chilling part is how often the warning sat right there beforehand. Written in a journal, said out loud, threatened in public, treated as nothing until it became everything. These are 10 teenage girls who turned the ordinary end of young love into something nobody walked away from. Section 1. Amber Wright, a breakup, a lie, and a trap in Summerfield. Seath Tyler Jackson was 15 years old. He lived near Ocala in Central Florida, went to Bellevue High School, and had 2 older brothers and parents who adored him. In December of 2010, he started dating a girl his own age named Amber Wright. For a few months they were inseparable, the way a lot of young couples are. Then, in March of 2011, it fell apart. The breakup was not quiet, and it was not clean. Turned bitter fast, and it spilled out into the place where so many teenage fights now happen. Out in the open, on social media, for everyone to watch. Not long after the split, Amber started seeing an 18-year-old named Michael Bargo. That is where a normal teenage breakup began bending into something much darker. Bargo got it into his head, wrongly, that Seath had mistreated Amber while they were together. There was no evidence that Seath had ever done such a thing, but Bargo believed it, and he carried that belief like a grudge. Online, the old couple kept poking at each other. Some of Seath's earlier posts still seemed soft toward Amber. Later ones turned sharp, hinting that she had been with Bargo while she was supposed to be with him. Back and forth it went, public and ugly. The feud did not stay between two people, pulled in others, one by one, until a whole little group was circling the same fight. Amber's brother, 16-year-old Kyle Hooper, had once been friends with Seath. Friendship soured, partly over the breakup, and partly because Hooper believed Seath had been with a girl that he himself liked. Court documents later showed Hooper had told a friend in text messages that he wanted Seath gone for good. Bargo, meanwhile, kept getting angrier. At one point at Seath's own house, Bargo warned him to his face that he had a round with his name on it. Seath's mother overheard it. The group had a gathering spot. An older friend, 18-year-old Charlie Ely, lived in a mobile home in rural Summerfield, southeast of Ocala. Bargo, Hooper, and a 20-year-old named Justin Soto spent a lot of time there, and Amber was often around too. Bargo kept a small .22 caliber firearm inside that home. The warning signs were already flashing well. Before anything final happened, in early April, during one confrontation, Bargo and Hooper fired that weapon to scare Seath and a friend away from the property. Looking back, it reads like a rehearsal that nobody stopped. On April 17, 2011, the loose threats hardened into a plan. Investigators, and later, the courts laid out who drove it. Bargo was the one pushing to be rid of Seath, and the others fell in around him. But the plan had a problem. Seath was not going to walk willingly into a house full of people who hated him. He needed a reason to come. He needed to be invited by the one person he might still trust. That person was Amber, and this is the part that puts her name at the front of this story. That night, Amber sent Seath a message built on a simple, believable lie. She told him she wanted to talk. Maybe, she suggested, they could work things out and get back together. To a 15-year-old who had recently lost his first real relationship. It was the most natural pull in the world. Seath had spent part of the evening with a friend named William Samalot. They went their separate ways around 9:15 at night, and Seath headed off toward Ely's home, drawn there by the promise that his ex-girlfriend wanted him back. What waited for him inside was an ambush. The moment he arrived, the group set upon him. He was hit on the head with a heavy object and fired upon with the .22, hurt and terrified. He managed to tear himself loose and run out of the house. While Amber and Charlie stayed behind in another room, he did not get far. He was caught in the front yard, struck again with a long wooden handle, and dragged back inside. There, Bargo fired the weapon a final time, and Seath lost his life. He had turned 15 only that February. What the group did afterward is hard to read, and there is no gentle way to summarize it. They placed his remains in a sleeping bag and set it in a fire pit in the backyard, where it stayed for hours. The next morning, a 37-year-old man tied to the family. Amber and Kyle's stepfather, James Havens, helped them dispose of what was left. The ashes were sealed inside 5-gallon paint cans and dumped into a water-filled rock quarry near Ocala. The home was scrubbed down with bleach to wipe away any trace that anything had happened there at all. For a few hours they may have believed they had gotten away with it. They had not. Thoughts. On April 18, Seath's parents reported him missing after they could not reach him. Case did not crack from the outside. It broke open from within the group itself. Kyle Hooper told his and Amber's mother, Tracy, what had been done. On April 19, she went to the Marion County authorities and told them. Within about a day, all 6 people connected to the plot were under arrest. Few days after that, more than 370 people filled a Summerfield church to say goodbye to a boy who should have been finishing the 9th grade. Prosecutors made an unusual choice. They tried each participant separately, and they tried the teenagers as adults rather than as juveniles. Over the next 2 years, the cases moved through the courts one at a time, and the outcomes were severe. Charlie Ely went first. In September 2011, a jury found her guilty of first-degree murder for luring Seath alongside Amber and for letting her home be used, and she was handed a life sentence. The story took a turn. Years later, when a federal agreed that her trial judge lawyer had failed her so badly that the conviction could not stand, thrown out, and in June 2020, she pleaded guilty to a lesser charge. Having already spent about 9 years behind bars, she walked free. Justin Soto pleaded guilty in May 2012 and received life. Post. Amber Wright and her brother Kyle Hooper were tried together in June 2012, each in front of a separate jury, and both were found guilty of first-degree murder because they had been under 18 when it happened. Neither one could face the harshest possible punishment, so both were sentenced to life. For Amber, that was not the end. An appeals court found that police had questioned her without properly explaining her rights, and her conviction was overturned. She was put on trial a second time in January 2016. New jury, hearing the case fresh, reached the very same verdict, guilty. February 2016, she was sentenced once more to life, this time with a chance at parole only after she serves 25 years. Her brother's sentence was later reshaped the same way. Michael Bargo, named by the court as the ringleader and the one who fired the final round, was the last to be convicted in August 2013. The judge, David Eddy, said it was the most cold, calculated and planned-out case he had seen in 32 years on the bench, and he sentenced Bargo to capital punishment. At the time, the youngest person awaiting that sentence anywhere in Florida. The sentence was later set aside because of a change in how Florida juries are required to vote. Bargo was sentenced to capital punishment a second time in 2019, and that ruling was upheld in 2021. He remains in state custody. James Havens, the older man who helped get rid of what was left, was for a time found mentally unfit to stand trial, then pleaded guilty in 2018 to being an accessory after the fact. Now, the precise thing about Amber Wright, because the entire case turns on it. Amber did not strike Seath. She did not fire the weapon. During the worst of it, she was tucked away in another room. Part was different, and in the eyes of two separate juries, every bit as serious. She was the bait. Strip her message out of that night, and Seath Jackson never walks through that door. The plan only worked because it needed someone he trusted, and she was the one person on Earth who could play that role for him. Breakup was the engine, and the lie about getting back together was the key that turned it. Her defense in both trials was that she had believed Bargo was only joking whenever he talked about getting rid of Seath, and that she never thought any of it was real. Two juries did not buy it. Florida law treats a person who knowingly helps plan and set in motion something like this as just as guilty as the person who carries it out, even if they never lay a finger on the victim. And that is exactly how Amber was judged. Twice. At one hearing, Seath's mother, Sonia, spoke straight at Amber. She told her she hoped the guilt would eat at her from the inside, and she reminded her that her son would never have been inside that house without Amber's manipulation. She was not reaching for drama. She was describing plainly how the whole thing actually worked. The case became national news, and later the subject of true crime television, in large part because of that detail. The idea that an invitation from an ex-girlfriend, the most ordinary thing in a teenager's life, could be turned into a weapon. Amber Wright was 15. So was the boy she invited over. The distance between a breakup and what happened in Summerfield was supposed to be unimaginable. For one night, in one small Florida town, it was almost nothing at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Amber Wright needed an entire group to finish what her message started. The next girl in this story needed no one but herself. At first, what she did looked like nothing more than a horrible accident on a quiet road, right up until investigators began asking a single, simple question she could never answer. Why, in the seconds before impact, did she never once touch the brakes? Section 2. Mackenzie Sherilla. The crash, a judge said, was no accident. Mackenzie Sherilla was 17 years old and had just finished high school in Strongsville, Ohio, a quiet suburb southwest of Cleveland. She was not a shadowy figure. She was popular, well known around Strongsville High, and she ran a busy social media account where she posted about her clothes and her lifestyle to a large following. Companies sent her free products to show off. Classmates remembered her as someone who liked attention and got it. By the summer of 2022, she had the kind of life a lot of teenagers would envy from the outside. She also had a boyfriend named Dominic Russo. He was 20, a little older, and the two of them had been together for about 4 years after meeting at the same high school. Their relationship was long, but it was not smooth, according to Dominic's family. The couple broke up and got back together over and over again. In 2021, they moved in together, and in the roughly 6 months before everything ended, Christine said the tension between them got worse, with members of the family later describing times when Mackenzie treated Dominic badly. One account that came out later involved a day in July 2022 when Dominic called his mother upset, and a family friend was sent to come get him. That friend said she arrived to find Mackenzie shouting that she was going to wreck the car right then and there. and trying to swing at Dominic. Around the same time, a video surfaced of Mackenzie threatening to break into Dominic's house. These accounts came from the people closest to Dominic, and they would later become a central part of the case against her. There was a third young person caught up in all of this, and his name matters just as much. Davion Flanagan, 19 years old. Davion was a friend of both Mackenzie and Dominic. He had been a school athlete, and he had been adopted at the age of 8 by his guardian, Jamie Flanagan. He was not part of the couple's drama. He was simply a friend who happened to be around. Prosecutor would later put it in the bluntest possible way, saying Davion had gotten into the wrong seat in the wrong car. That, to Mackenzie, he was little more than cargo in the back. It is one of the saddest details in the entire case, because by every account, Davion had nothing to do with any of the trouble between the other two. The last night of their lives looked at first like a normal summer night for 3 young people. On July 30, 2022, the 3 of them went to a graduation party at a friend's house at around 10:15 in the evening. They stayed less than an hour, then drove to another friend's place around 11, where they spent the night listening to music and getting high. They were there for hours, sometime around 5:30 in the morning on July 31. The 3 of them left together, with Mackenzie behind the wheel of her 2018 Toyota Camry, Dominic in the front passenger seat, and Davion in the back. A few minutes later, a security camera caught the car turning onto a street called Progress Drive. Second camera, moments after, caught it again, this time racing down the road with its lights on, straight toward a large brick building called the Plidco Building, where the road dead-ended. Car did not slow down. It slammed into the corner of that brick wall at around 100 miles per hour. The impact landed almost exactly on the passenger side, where Dominic was sitting. The damage was so severe that one of the officers who later saw it said the car had split into 2 pieces, and another said it was the worst he had ever come across. First responders did not reach the wreck until roughly 45 minutes after it happened. When they got there, all 3 young people were unconscious, not breathing, and trapped inside. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were pronounced gone at the scene. Mackenzie survived, but she had multiple broken bones and had to be flown to a hospital where she went through several surgeries, and there was one detail the responders noted that would echo through the entire case afterward. When they found her, her foot was still pressing down on the gas pedal. In those first days, this looked like a horrific accident. Police initially treated it that way, even raising the possibility that something had been wrong with the car. But an expert who examined the Camry concluded it had been in perfect working order before the crash. Mackenzie, for her part, told investigators she had blacked out and had no memory of what happened at all. What turned the case was, in part, what Mackenzie did afterward, and the people who noticed. While recovering, she kept posting on social media. Her account actually grew more popular during her hospital stay, and modelling agencies reportedly reached out to her. She posted clips of herself from the hospital and later videos of herself out in a wheelchair at concerts. She shared joking videos, including one where she made light of being someone who could use a lot of drugs and walk away fine. At one point, she posted old photos of Dominic and Davion in Halloween costumes to families of the 2 young men who had just lost their lives. This did not look like grief. Davion's sister grew suspicious. The families pushed the police to look harder, so they did. Investigators pulled location data from Mackenzie's devices, and they found something that troubled them. She had driven to that same quiet industrial area 3 days before the crash for prosecution. that looked like preparation, a scouting trip. Police came to believe the crash had not been an accident at all, but something she meant to do, in a place chosen because the streets would be empty in the pre-dawn hours. Their theory went even further and darker, that she did not intend for anyone in that car to survive, including herself, and that the trigger was her fear that Dominic was going to leave the relationship for good. Again, on November 4, 2022, not long after she was released from the hospital, Mackenzie Shirilla was arrested. She was initially charged with 17 crimes, including the most serious forms of the charge a person can face in Ohio, along with charges connected to illegal drugs that police said they had found on her. The case would come down to a single, enormous question that the physical evidence alone could not fully answer. Did she mean to do it? Her lawyer made a notable choice. Instead of a jury, the defense asked for a bench trial, meaning a single judge would decide her guilt. That judge was Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Judge Nancy Margaret Russo, who, despite the shared last name, had no relation to Dominic Russo. August 14, 2023. After hearing all of it, Judge Russo delivered her verdict, and she did not hold back. She said plainly that this was not reckless driving, that it was, in her judgment, murder, she said. She said Mackenzie had a mission and carried it out with precision, that her actions were controlled, deliberate, and purposeful, and that the decision had been to bring about exactly what happened. She described her as hell on wheels. The court found Mackenzie guilty on all counts in front of her. 12 felonies in total, including 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts tied to causing the deaths on the road, and counts related to the drugs. A week later, on August 21, 2023, came the sentencing. Devian Flanagan's sister asked the court to give Mackenzie the longest sentence possible. Dominic Russo's mother told her she should be thankful. She still had her life and a future ahead of her, something her son and Davion no longer had. The judge handed down 2 life sentences, one for each young man, to be served at the same time, with no chance to even ask for parole until she has served 15 years. She also permanently took away Mackenzie's driver's license. The car had been treated in the end as the weapon. But this is the part of the story that has to be told honestly, because it is the part that is still being argued. Mackenzie Shirilla has never admitted that she did this on purpose. From the beginning, she said she blacked out and remembered nothing. Defense argued there was not enough proof to support a finding that she meant to crash, and it was not only her own side saying so. When a higher court later reviewed the case, the appeals decision itself noted that several witnesses had testified that she and Dominic were in a loving relationship, and that Mackenzie suffered from a medical condition that can cause dizziness, a fact that, in another reading of the evidence, could point toward a medical event rather than a plan. Parents, Natalie and Steve Shirilla, have stood by her the entire time. As recently as 2025, they spoke publicly to say they believe the crash was never intentional, and that they see no real evidence of planning at all. The courts, so far, have not agreed with them. First appeal, filed in September 2023, argued that the evidence was too thin and that mistakes had been made at trial. The 8th District Court of Appeals rejected it and upheld her conviction. Later attempt to win a new trial was turned away as well, in part because it was filed too late and Ohio's highest court declined to step in. Through 25 and into 2026, the convictions held. As of now, Mackenzie Shirilla is held at the Ohio Reformatory for Women, and her first parole hearing is not scheduled until 2038. Case did not fade after the verdict. If anything, it grew, became the subject of a hit documentary on Netflix, along with television specials and podcasts, pulling millions of new eyes to a crash in a small Ohio suburb years after it happened for the families of Dominic and Davion. That attention has been a fresh wound. Dominic's sister, Christine Russo, has gone so far as to push for a new law. One she and the Flanagan family have nicknamed after the two young men, aimed at stopping people convicted of serious crimes from profiting off the fame their cases bring in the age of social media. Davion's family created a scholarship in his name to help young people training to become barbers, trying to turn the memory of a 19-year-old who never asked to be in that car into something that lasts. What makes this case sit so heavily is the doubt baked into it. With the first girl in this series, the lie was written down, and the plan was confessed. Here, a judge had to look at a security tape, a foot on a gas pedal, and a string of social media posts, and decide what was in a teenager's heart in the seconds before a brick wall. Two families are certain, so is the court. One family still is not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, but not every case leaves that much room to wonder. Pratzed. The next young woman in this story did not black out, did not claim she couldn't remember, and did not leave investigators guessing about her intentions. She told people exactly what she was going to do before she ever did it. Out loud, in writing, where everyone could see. And then she went and did it anyway. Section 3. Rachel Wade, the warning she left 8 months. Before Rachel Wade was 19 years old, living in the Tampa Bay area of Florida, when a long, ugly fight over a boy ended a life and erased her own future. And the reason her name belongs in any conversation about young people who say out loud what they are about to do is simple. Months before anything happened, she left a recorded message telling another teenage girl, in the plainest words a person can use, that she intended to end her life. That girl saved it. 8 months later, a jury would hear it played in a courtroom. To understand any of this, you have to start with the young man at the center of it. His name was Joshua Camacho. He worked at a Chick-fil-A. And by the accounts that came out later, he was the kind of person who kept more than one girl believing she was the only one. Rachel Wade had dated him. So had a girl named Sarah Ludeman, who was 18, a high school senior in nearby Pinellas Park, and who was, by her family's account, in the first real relationship of her life. Girls were tangled up with the same boy, and for a long time neither of them fully understood that he was keeping the other one on the line at the same time. When the truth came into focus, it did not turn them against him. It turned them against each other. This is the part that matters for being honest about what kind of case this is. Rachel did not lash out at an ex-boyfriend. She did not harm Joshua, who walked away from the whole thing without ever being charged with anything. The person who lost her life was the other girl, the rival. Rachel and Joshua's relationship had cooled. He had moved towards Sarah, and instead of letting go, Rachel locked onto Sarah as the enemy. What began as a breakup of sorts curdled into an obsession between two young women who had never needed to be enemies at all. It is one of the most senseless shapes a relationship can take, because the anger gets pointed at the wrong person entirely. The feud did not happen in private, and it did not happen quickly, stretched across the better part of a year, and a huge amount of it played out online, where a generation that had just gotten phones in every pocket was learning, in real time, how easy it is to say the worst possible thing to someone you will never have to look in the eye. The two girls went at each other on MySpace, over text messages, and in voicemail after voicemail. They taunted, they threatened, they dared each other. Friends who watched it unfold later described it as constant, exhausting drama that never cooled down for long, only paused and flared back up. By account, Sarah would turn up at the Applebee's where Rachel worked just to needle her. By other accounts, Rachel was the one circling, calling, leaving messages. The simple truth is that both of them kept feeding it, and neither one would walk away. There were warnings everywhere if anyone had been in a position to add them up. In the first 6 months that Sarah was with Joshua, police in Pinellas Park spoke with Rachel on 6 separate occasions over public blow-ups connected to him. There was a moment when Joshua reportedly hit Sarah in the face, and she chose not to press charges. Sarah's parents had grown uneasy about the relationship from the start. They noticed bruises on their daughter that she brushed off as horseplay, and there were photos on her phone of Joshua showing off a firearm. The adults in his kids could feel that something was wrong. What none of them could seize was how it would end. The single loudest warning came in August of 2008. That month, Rachel left Sarah a voicemail in which she said, with no softening and no doubt about her meaning, that she was going to end Sarah's life. It was not a vague insult. It was a stated intention, and here is the detail that would matter most of all. Sarah kept it. She saved that message, and then it sat on her phone for 8 long months while the feud ground on, a recording of one teenager promising to do the exact thing that was, eventually, done. Everything came to a head late on the night of April 14, 2009. Rachel and Sarah had spent the evening arguing again, first by text and then by phone, each one circling the other the way they had for months. At one point that night, by the timeline investigators pieced together, Rachel waited near a friend's house for Sarah to come out, then left when she didn't appear, but the two were on a collision course, and they finally met in person in the dark. A group had gathered, voices were up, and in the chaos, Rachel had a blade from the kitchen with her. What happened next took only seconds. In the middle of the confrontation with people shouting and pushing, Rachel moved forward toward the car. Sarah was near and struck her a single time in the chest. One blow. It was enough. Force behind it was so severe that the blade itself was left bent. A detail the prosecutor would later point to as proof of how hard the strike had been driven home. Sarah Ludeman, 18 years old, did not survive it. Relationship she'd stumbled into. As a teenager, her very first, ended with her life. The way Rachel behaved in the minutes afterward became one of the things people could never shake about this case. While other teenagers at the scene were hysterical, screaming and running, a police sergeant who arrived, Tina Trahey, later told the jury what she had seen in Rachel. Calmness, and a strange lack of concern about any of it. The sergeant said Rachel did not cry. She did not seem upset. At one point, with everything falling apart around her, Rachel asked the officer if she could have a cigarette. For the jurors who would later decide her fate, that picture, a girl sitting quietly and asking for a smoke while another girl lay dying nearby, was hard to square with the story Rachel's side would try to tell. Because Rachel did have a defense, and it is important to lay it out fairly. She was charged with second-degree murder, and from the very beginning she and her attorney, Jay Hebert, argued that this was not a planned act, but self-protection. Their version was that Sarah and a group of friends had come that night to gang up on Rachel, that Rachel feared for her own safety after months of threats flying in both directions, and that it was Sarah, not Rachel, who started the fight that turned deadly. In that telling, Rachel was a frightened girl who lashed out in a moment of real danger. To this day, Rachel maintains that she acted in self-defense. Prosecution told a very different story, and they had the recordings to back it. Prosecutors Lizette Harnowitz and Wesley Dykes pointed the jury at the long history of Rachel's aggression. The calls, the messages, the police contacts, and above all that saved voicemail from 8 months earlier in which Rachel had announced, in advance, exactly what she intended to do. They emphasized that Rachel had brought a blade to the confrontation, person genuinely afraid and acting purely in the heat of a surprise attack. They argued, does not arrive already armed after spending months promising to do this very thing. The witnesses lined up against her too. Joshua Camacho testified, as did his sister and a young man named Dustin Grimes. And both Camacho's sister and Grimes told the court that they saw Rachel approach the car and strike Sarah. The defense had a witness who said the two girls fought, but he admitted he had not actually seen much of what happened. In the end, it came down to that voicemail and that blade. The jury, 5 men and 1 woman, did not need long. After deliberating for under 3 hours, they found Rachel Wade guilty of second-degree murder. On September 3, 2010, she was sentenced to 27 years in state prison. The judge made his own view plain when he handed down that sentence, stating that he believed Rachel had intended to take Sarah's life. Before the sentence came down, Rachel took the stand and spoke directly to Sarah's parents, Hertz, telling them she was sorry to be the one who had caused them such enormous pain, and saying there were days she felt it should have been her instead. Whether that apology was real remorse or a plea for a lighter sentence is something only she knows. The years she received did not bend either way for it. The aftermath of this case carried a lesson that has only gotten louder in the years since. Rachel appealed, still insisting she had acted to protect herself, and her appeals failed. But in a television interview in 2011, she said something that has stuck with a lot of people who study these kinds of tragedies. She talked about the role social media had played in the whole thing. How the constant online back and forth had let the rivalry grow into something monstrous. Because these platforms gave 2 teenagers the ability to say absolutely anything to each other, with almost no consequence in the moment. Cruelty was easy. The threats were easy. Typing that you were going to end someone took less effort than saying it to their face. And so it got said, over and over, until one day it stopped being words. For a case that happened in the early days of phones and MySpace, it reads now like a warning about a problem that has only multiplied. But there are a few hard facts that sit at the edges of this story and refuse to settle. Joshua Camacho, the boy both girls had been fighting over, was never charged with anything at all. He walked away from a situation he had helped create, and he kept his freedom while one of the girls was buried, and the other was sent away for decades. The case became well known enough to be turned into a television movie, the kind of dramatized retelling that sometimes does more to flatten a tragedy than to explain it. And Rachel Wade is still in prison, as of recent reporting. She is in her mid-30s, held at the Lowell Correctional Institution in Florida, with her release projected for the early 2030s. More than 2 decades after a single moment in a dark street undid 3 young lives, counting her own. What makes Rachel Wade's case different from a sudden, unplanned tragedy is that the intent was on the record long before the act. Fury was documented in her own voice. She did not black out. She did not claim she could not remember. And she did not leave anyone guessing about how she felt toward the girl she saw as her enemy. She had said it. She had recorded it. Then, in a moment that may genuinely have felt to her like chaos and fear, the words she had been throwing around for the better part of a year became real in a way that could never be pulled back. Voicemail, meant to be a threat, became, instead, the strongest piece of evidence against her. Before we move on, If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rachel Wade lashed out at a girl she saw as competition. In a fight that exploded in a matter of seconds, the next young woman didn't explode. She decided, calmly and a full day in advance, that another girl simply had to go, over a boyfriend that girl may never have even wanted. And she gathered help, chose a quiet patch of woods, and drew her there with a promise to make peace. Section 4. Krista Pike. A rivalry that existed mostly in her own head. Krista Pike was 18 years old, and by the start of 1995, she had landed in Knoxville, Tennessee, at a place that was supposed to be a turning point. The Job Corps Center is a federal program that gives young people from rough circumstances a shot at job training and a fresh start. Vocational classes, a dorm, a chance to build a future that their childhoods had not handed them. Pike's childhood had handed her very little. By the accounts that came out later in court, she had grown up around neglect and abuse, had been harmed by people who should have protected her, and had already tried to end her own life more than once before she was old enough to drive. Job Corps was meant to be the place where the bad years stopped. Instead, it became the place where she did something that would define the rest of her life and put her at the very edge of the law's harshest punishment. The young woman whose life she took had come to the same program for the very same reason. Colleen Slemmer was 19, and she had moved all the way from Pennsylvania to enroll in a 6-month computing course. She wanted a skill, a job, a future she could be proud of. The two of them ended up at the same center, in the same orbit of students, and under almost any other circumstances, their paths might have crossed and parted, without anyone ever remembering it. What turned that ordinary overlap into something deadly was a boy, and more than the boy, it was what Pike convinced herself the boy meant. That boy was Darrell Shipp, Pike's boyfriend, a year younger than she was. Two of them had grown close fast, and they shared an interest that set them apart from the other students. A fascination with the occult and with darker things, the kind of teenage flirtation with the sinister that usually stays harmless. Pike's case, it didn't. Somewhere in the early weeks of 1995, she got it into her head that Colleen Slemmer was after Shipp. She became convinced that this other girl wanted to take him from her, and that conviction hardened into a fixed, gnawing obsession. Here is the part that makes the whole case so senseless, and it has to be said plainly. The threat may never have been real at all. People who actually knew Colleen Slemmer said she had no designs on Shipp, no interest in stealing anyone's boyfriend, nothing of the kind. Rivalry that drove everything that followed appears to have lived almost entirely inside Krista Pike's own mind. She built an enemy out of a girl who, by most accounts, simply wanted to finish her computer course and go home, and then she decided that enemy had to be dealt with. She did not keep the decision to herself either. Day before anything happened, Pike told a fellow student and friend, plainly, that she intended to take Slemmer's life. And when that friend pressed her on why, Pike's explanation was as shallow as it gets. She said she had just felt mean that day. She told Shipp in cruder terms that the other girl needed to be taught a lesson. The intent was spoken out loud to more than one person before a single thing was done. It was not a moment of blind rage. It was a plan that Pike talked about first and then carried out. On the evening of January 12, 1995, the plan went into motion, and it began with a lie that sounded like kindness. Pike approached Slemmer with what looked like an olive branch, a suggestion that they put their problems behind them, smooth things over, maybe share some marijuana, and call a truce to a girl who had been the target of someone else's hostility. A peace offering would have been a relief. Slemmer agreed to come along. Around 8 o'clock that night, 4 young people signed out of the dormitory together. Pike, Slemmer, Ship, and another student named Shadola Peterson. They walked away from the safety of the centre and toward a wooded, abandoned area near the University of Tennessee's agricultural campus. An old, deserted steam plant where no one would see or hear them. There was never going to be any peace made in those woods. The moment they were isolated, Pike turned on the reason she had brought Slemmer there at all, accusing her of trying to take her boyfriend. Slemmer denied it, because by every indication there was nothing to admit. The denial didn't matter. What followed was roughly half an hour of sustained cruelty. Pike and Ship set upon Slemmer with weapons they had carried into the woods for exactly this purpose. While Peterson kept watch, they tormented her, hurt her again and again, and at one point cut an occult symbol, a pentagram, into her body. The ordeal stretched on far longer than a sudden, panicked attack ever would. Long enough that the prolonged nature of it became one of the most chilling facts of the entire case. It ended when Pike struck Slemmer in the head with a heavy chunk of pavement, and Colleen Slemmer, 19 years old, lost her plight to life in a place she had been told she was going to make peace. Pike did next is the detail that has followed her name for 30 years. Before leaving, she took a fragment of bone from Slemmer's body and kept it. A trophy, a souvenir of what she had done. Around 10:15 that night, Pike, Ship, and Peterson walked back to the Job Corps Centre. Slemmer was not with them, and she never would be again. The crime did not stay hidden, and in the end it was Pike's own choices that undid her. Slemmer's body was discovered, and within 2 days, by January 14, investigators had focused on Pike. When they searched her, they found the piece of bone she had taken, still in her possession. A piece of physical evidence so damning and so disturbing that it tied her to the act beyond any doubt. Pike gave a statement to police, and in the time afterward, rather than showing any sign of regret, she wrote to Ship about what she had done in language that was almost unbelievably cold, describing in her own words how she had finished Slemmer off, and complaining about the punishment she now faced, as if she were the one who had been wronged. There was no remorse in it. There was something closer to pride. When the case reached trial in 1996, the evidence against Pike was overwhelming. Her own statements, the testimony of those who had been there, and that fragment of bone. She was convicted of first-degree murder and of conspiring to carry it out. Then came the sentence, and it made history in a grim way. The court condemned Krista Pike to capital punishment. 18 years old at the time of the crime, she became the youngest woman in the United States sentenced to that fate, and she remains, to this day, the only woman on Tennessee's row for the condemned. Girl who had arrived at a program built on second chances had, within months, thrown her own life away as completely as she had taken Slemmer's. 2 people who helped her met very different ends. To Darrell Ship, because he had been under 18 when it happened, could not be given the ultimate punishment. He was convicted and sentenced to life, with the possibility of one day seeking parole. Shadola Peterson, the third student who had stood watch, cooperated with prosecutors and testified about what she had seen, and in exchange she avoided a prison sentence altogether. So of the 3 young people who walked into those woods with Colleen Slemmer, only one walked out, facing the prospect of being put to death, and it was the one whose jealousy had set the whole thing moving. If there was ever any hope that prison would soften Krista Pike, she put an end to it herself. 2001, while behind bars, she attacked a fellow inmate, attempting to choke the other woman with a shoelace. She was convicted over that attack in 2004, and another 25 years were added to a sentence she was already unlikely to outlive. It reinforced, for the people following her case, the same impression her letter had left years earlier, that the capacity for sudden, cold violence had not been a one-time aberration brought on by teenage heartbreak. It was simply part of who she was. For decades after, Pike's case moved through the appeals courts the way capital cases do. Slowly, repeatedly, with arguments about her troubled upbringing and the quality of her legal defense. Appeals were turned away. Her lawyers raised her history of abuse and the genuine horrors of her childhood, and while that history is real and was documented in court, it was not enough to undo the verdict or the sentence. 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court, Tennessee execution set an execution date, formally scheduling the end that had been hanging over her since 1996. As of now, she remains on death row, still the only woman the state holds there. Her case once again pulling national attention 3 decades after a 19-year-old computing student was led into the woods and never came back. What lingers about this case, more than the brutality, is how staggeringly small the reason was. Strip away the horror of what happened in those woods, and you are left with a teenager who became convinced that another teenager wanted her boyfriend. A belief that the people around the victim say was never even true, and who decided that the appropriate response to that imagined betrayal was to plan a killing, announce it to her friends, lure the girl with a fake truce, and carry it out over the course of half an hour. The gap between the triviality of the grievance and the enormity of the act is almost impossible to hold in your head at once. Colleen Slemmer did not do anything to Krista Pike. She was a stranger from Pennsylvania who happened to share a campus with a young woman whose jealousy needed a target, and she paid for that coincidence with her life. It would be easy to file Krista Pike away as simply a monster, and in the worst moments of this story, she certainly behaves like one. But the fuller, harder truth is that she was also an 18-year-old who had been failed at nearly every stage of her own life, long before she failed Colleen Slemmer. So catastrophically, both of those things are true at the same time. Neither one cancels the other out, and neither one brings back the young woman who died in those woods believing, for a few short minutes, that she was finally about to make peace. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Krista Pike did her own damage with her own hands. In a frenzy, in the dark, and she was exactly the kind of troubled outsider that people expect to find at the centre of a story like this. The next young woman could not have been more different on the surface. She was a star, top of her class, headed for a military academy, the kind of polished, ambitious teenager adults held up as an example to everyone else. And she decided that another girl had to die over a betrayal that may never have even happened, then pulled the boy who loved her into helping her make it real. Section 5. Diane Zamora. The Golden Couple and a Jealous Lie. If you had drawn up a list of teenagers least likely to be involved in taking a life, Diane Zamora's name would have sat near the top. She was 17 years old, a standout honor student at Crowley High School in Texas, the kind of disciplined, driven young woman teachers remember for decades. She had her whole future mapped out, and it was a glittering one. She had earned a place at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, one of the most selective and prestigious institutions in the country. She dreamed of becoming an astronaut. By every outward measure, Diane Zamora was going to be somebody. She had a boyfriend who matched her ambition exactly. David Graham, 18, was an honor student at nearby Mansfield High School and was bound for the United States Air Force Academy. He wanted to be a pilot. The two of them had met years earlier, as 14-year-olds, at a Civil Air Patrol meeting, and they had fallen into the kind of intense, all-consuming young relationship that felt to them like destiny. They started dating in the summer of 1995, and within about a month they were engaged, already planning a wedding for after they finished their military training. On paper, they were the golden couple, two clean-cut, high-achieving kids on their way to serve their country. Underneath that polished surface, something far darker was taking shape. The young woman whose life would be destroyed by all of it was 16-year-old Adrienne Jones. Friends called her AJ. She was a sophomore at Mansfield High, the same school David Graham attended, and she ran on the cross-country team with him. She was an honor student herself, with plans to go to Texas A&M University and become a behavioral analyst. She had a mother and father and two brothers who loved her. Adrienne knew David only as a teammate. She had no idea that she had become the center of a jealous obsession in the mind of a girl she had likely never even met. The spark for everything was a confession David made to Diane. And to this day, no one can say for certain whether the thing he confessed even happened. According to the accounts that came out later, David told Diane that on a day in November 1995, after a track meet, he had given Adrienne a ride and had a sexual encounter with her. When he finally admitted this to Diane weeks later, during an argument, her reaction was not ordinary heartbreak. By her own account in her confession, she began screaming, banging her head against the floor, and shouting over and over for Adrienne to be killed. And then she made a demand that would define both their lives. She told David that if he truly loved her, he would prove it by ending the life of the girl he had been with. The relationship, in her mind, could only be saved by erasing the person she saw as the stain on it. This is where the case becomes almost unbearably senseless. Because of what investigators would later uncover, there is strong reason to believe the encounter David confessed to never actually took place. Trial, a teammate named Wendy Bartlett, and a coach testified that it was Bartlett, not David, who drove Adrienne home that day, and that David had already left. Lead investigator put it as plainly as anyone could. If David had simply told Diane he had made the whole thing up to provoke her, Adrienne Jones would still be alive. David's story about the encounter shifted over the years. He later said it did happen, then that it didn't, then that it did, and he'd only denied it on a lawyer's advice. And the truth has never been fully pinned down, but the possibility that hangs over the entire case is staggering. That a 16-year-old girl lost her life over a betrayal that may have been nothing more than a teenage boy's lie, told to make his girlfriend jealous. Whatever the truth of the encounter, the plan that followed was real, and it was cold. David would lure Adrienne out under a friendly pretense. Diane would be there too, hidden, waiting. They intended to take her to a remote spot near Joe Pool Lake and dispose of her body there. On the night of December 3, 1995, David phoned Adrienne and arranged to pick her up. Adrienne, suspecting nothing, slipped out of her house. One of her brothers later recalled hearing her leave. What she did not know was that, as she climbed into David's car, Diane Zamora was crouched in the hatchback behind her, listening. They drove to a dark, isolated area near the lake, arriving sometime after midnight. When the car stopped, Diane emerged from her hiding place and confronted Adrienne, directly demanding to know whether she had been with David. The encounter turned violent within moments. Struggle broke out, and Diane struck Adrienne over the head with a heavy dumbbell weight. Adrienne fought back hard, managed to break free, and ran out into the open field in the dark, trying to escape. She did not make it. David went after her with a 9mm handgun and fired at her twice, the second time at close range. Adrienne Jones, 16 years old, lost her life in a field she had been driven to by someone she trusted as a teammate. What the two of them did next reveals just how composed they were able to be afterward. According to Diane's confession, when David returned to the car, he asked her whether she believed him now, as if the killing had been a gift, a proof of devotion. The two of them then cleaned themselves up, got rid of their stained clothing, and Diane scrubbed out her car, and in a detail that chills nearly everyone who hears it, Diane later wrote in her personal calendar, beside that date, the victim's name and a time. Adrienne, 1:38 in the morning. She had made a tidy little note of the moment she helped end a girl's life. Adrienne's body was discovered later that same day, lying in an open field. First, investigators had no idea who she was. She came in as an unidentified Jane Doe. The medical examiner determined she had suffered blunt force injuries to the head and had been fired upon, and that the shooter had been standing very close. There was no sign she had been sexually assaulted. Once a photograph reached the examiner, the Jane Doe was identified as the missing Adrienne Jones. Identifying the victim and identifying who was responsible were two very different things. The investigation went cold. There was nothing obvious tying a couple of academy-bound honour students to a body in a field. And for 9 long months, Diane and David appeared to have gotten away with it completely. David went off to the Air Force Academy in Colorado. Diane went off to the Naval Academy in Maryland. Their golden futures rolled on as if nothing had happened. Then Diane Zamora did the one thing the perfect plan could not survive. She talked, roughly 9 months after the killing. At the Naval Academy, she confided in her 2 roommates what she and David had done. She framed it, astonishingly, almost as a love story, boasting that her boyfriend had loved her so much that he had taken a life for her. To the young women hearing it, it was not romantic. It was horrifying. They reported what she had said to Academy authorities, who contacted police back in Texas. The cold case roared back to life. On September 6, 1996, both Diane Zamora and David Graham were arrested and charged with capital murder. Under questioning, both of them confessed. David was interrogated for around 30 hours before admitting his role. Diane gave her own account as well. Core of their 2 stories matched in the way that mattered. Adrienne had been targeted because of the supposed encounter with David, lured to the lake, struck on the head by Diane, and fired upon by David. The weapon, a 9mm handgun believed to be the one used, was found hidden in an attic reachable through David's bedroom. Then, as so often happens once the lawyers get involved, both of them tried to take it all back. David claimed he had only helped cover up a killing Diane committed alone. Diane claimed the opposite, that David had done it by himself. Each tried to shove the full weight onto the other. The juries did not buy either version. They were tried separately in 1998. In a moment of extraordinary grace, Adrienne's mother, Linda Jones, asked prosecutors not to seek the death penalty against either of the people who had taken her daughter, a mercy that the killers themselves had shown Adrienne none of. In February 1998, a jury found Diane Zamora guilty of capital murder because of the family's wishes. She received a mandatory sentence of life in prison, with no chance to even apply for parole until she has served 40 years. That July, in his own trial, David Graham was likewise convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life. The reason the charge was capital murder rather than ordinary murder came down to how Adrienne was taken. Deceived and lured from the safety of her home, then killed in part so she could never tell anyone what had happened. The The case became a national sensation, and it is easy to see why. Contrast was irresistible to the public. Two squeaky clean, brilliant, military-bound teenagers, the very picture of discipline and promise, revealed as the architects of a cold and jealous killing. There was a television movie made about it before Diane's trial had even finished. Books were written. The trial drew enormous audiences. Much of the fascination circled one question that the public could never quite settle. Was Diane Zamora the helpless girl swept along by a manipulative boyfriend, or was she the true engine of the whole thing? The one whose jealousy lit the fuse and whose demand turned a lie into a death. The years she has given interviews insisting she never meant for Adrian to die, that she was guilty only of helping cover it up afterward, even submitting to a lie detector test on national television that did nothing to clear her. Jury had already decided the central fact, that she intended for Adrian Jones to die. Diane and David remain in Texas prisons to this day, not eligible to seek parole until roughly 4 decades after the night at the lake. When you strip this case down to its core, it shares something unsettling with the one before it. Like Krista Pike, Diane Zamora aimed her fury at a romantic rival. And like Pike, that rival may have been guilty of nothing at all. Adrian Jones may never have touched David Graham. She may simply have been a name in a lie, a teenage boy told to make his girlfriend jealous. And on the strength of that, a 16-year-old honor student with her whole life in front of her was lured into a field in the dark and never came home. The difference between Pike and Zamora is only on the surface. One a troubled outsider acting in a frenzy, the other a polished future officer who planned it and gave the command. The thing underneath, the engine, was identical. A jealousy so total that another person's existence became unbearable. Turns out a perfect transcript, and a place at a military academy offer no protection at all against that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next girl in this story was younger than Zamora, still sitting in a high school classroom, and her rivalry was a far more ordinary teenage tangle. A boyfriend, an ex, and a new girl who paid attention to both. What sets her case apart is not the reason behind it, which is almost mundane, is what she and another teenager did afterward, in the days that followed, to try to make the evidence. And it is among the most disturbing things in this entire video. Section 6. Sarah Kolb, the new girl who got close to the wrong ex-Adrian Reynolds, was 16 years old and trying to start over. She had grown up in Kilgore, Texas, but in the fall of 2004 she moved more than 900 miles north to East Moline, Illinois, to live with her grandfather and step-grandmother, Tony and Joanne Reynolds. The move was a fresh start, and Adrienne had a clear plan for what she wanted to do with it. She enrolled at the Black Hawk College Outreach Center, an alternative program where young people who had left traditional high school could earn their GGD. Because she had a dream. She wanted to join the Marines. She was, by every account, an outgoing, friendly girl who wanted to be liked at her new school, and at that outreach center, she met 2 people who would end her life before she ever got the chance to put on a uniform. First was Sarah Kolb, 16, who lived nearby in the town of Milan with her mother and stepfather. By the descriptions that came out later, Sarah was one of the more popular students at the outreach center, the kind of girl who sat at the center of her own little social circle and liked it that way. The second was Corey Gregory, 17, who had transferred in from Moline High School. Corey's place in Sarah's life is the detail that everything else hangs on, Sarah's former boyfriend, and, at the same time, her current best friend. The two of them had stayed tightly bound together after their romance ended, the way some teenagers do. And by most accounts, Corey remained almost devotedly loyal to Sarah. Tangled little arrangement. An ex-boyfriend who was still orbiting her closely was a quiet thing right up until a new girl walked in and started paying attention to him. That new girl was Adrienne. When she started at the centre, she became friendly with Corey. They talked, they passed notes, they spent time together. And in January of 2005, Adrienne reportedly did something simple and ordinary for a teenager. She asked Corey out. To anyone on the outside, it would have looked like nothing more than the everyday churn of high school-age crushes. To Sarah Kolb, it looked like a threat. Adrienne was moving in on the boy who was supposed to belong to Sarah's orbit, the ex who was still hers in every way that counted to her, the jealousy that took root over, that was, by any rational measure, small. The reaction it produced was anything but port. We know exactly how dark Sarah's thinking had gotten, because she wrote it down, in the time leading up to what happened. Sarah kept a journal, and that journal would later be read aloud in a courtroom as evidence against her, in an entry made the day before Adrienne lost her life. Just hours before, Sarah wrote in plain and vulgar terms that she was going to kill Adrienne Reynolds. It was not a private vent that went nowhere. It was a written statement of intent, set down on paper and then carried out almost immediately afterward. Krista Pike telling a friend the day before. Like the threats that ran through so many of these stories, the warning was right there in advance. Nobody who could have stopped it ever saw it in time. On the afternoon of January 21, 2005, Sarah invited Adrienne to come to lunch. It would be a group thing. Sarah, Corey, Adrienne, and another friend named Sean McKittrick, and they drove to a Taco Bell in the area. On the surface, it was 4 young people grabbing fast food on a winter afternoon, but almost as soon as they got there, Sarah and Adrienne started fighting in the car. The argument escalated fast. Sean, sensing something was very wrong, told Sarah to stop. Sarah's response was cold. She told him that if he didn't like it, he should leave. He did. He got out of the car and walked away, and in doing so he removed the one person present who might have put a stop to what came next. What happened in that parking lot took only minutes. Sarah set upon Adrienne and began choking her. When that alone didn't finish it, Corey Gregory joined in, holding Adrienne down and using a belt to cut off her air completely between the two of them in a fast food parking lot. In the middle of an ordinary day, 16-year-old Adrienne Reynolds was choked until she was gone. Her cause of death would later be recorded simply as strangulation. She had come to Illinois to build a future, and a girl's jealousy over an ex-boyfriend ended it in a parked car. If the killing itself is hard to take in, what the two of them did afterward is the part of this story that has horrified people for 2 decades. And it is the reason this case still gets talked about at all. Sarah and Corey did not panic and run. They did not call for help or turn themselves in. Instead, they loaded Adrienne's body into the car and drove out to a farm near Aledo, Illinois, that belonged to Sarah's grandparents. There, they tried to destroy her body with gasoline and fire. For several hours they worked at it, and it didn't work. A body does not burn the way people imagine it might. They did something that turns this from a tragedy into a nightmare. They recruited help. The help was a third teenager, 16-year-old Nathan Gourdet from Moline. They brought him into what they had done and asked him to make the body disappear. Nathan took his grandfather's handsaw and used it to cut Adrienne's body apart, removing her head and her arms and placing them into a garbage bag. Then, and in a detail that says more about the emptiness at the centre of all this than any other, the 3 of them went and got lunch at a McDonald's. They had just been part of taking a young woman's life and cutting her body to pieces, and they stopped for fast food. Afterward, they drove to the Black Hawk State Historic Site and disposed of the garbage bag there. Adrian's remains ended up split between the farm and that park, scattered in an effort to keep anyone from ever finding out what had been done. It did not work, and it fell apart fairly quickly. When Adrian failed to show up for her job at a nearby Checkers restaurant, her family realized something was wrong and reported her missing. The investigation moved fast, and within days the truth began to surface. On January 26, 2005, just 5 days after Adrian was killed, it was Corey Gregory who led law enforcement to her remains. The secret the three of them had gone to such grotesque lengths to bury was out, and all three were soon in custody. On February 1, 2005, Sarah Kolb and Corey Gregory were each charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and with concealment of a homicide. Both pleaded not guilty. Nathan Godet, the boy who had done the cutting, was charged with concealment for his role in hiding the body. From there, the cases took different paths, and the courtroom journey turned out to be a long one. Sarah was the first to face a jury. Trial began on October 31, 2005, at the Rock Island County Courthouse, and it ran for 2 weeks. Prosecution laid out the whole story. The jealousy over Corey. The journal entry in which Sarah had written that she would kill Adrian, the testimony of more than 50 witnesses, including the friend who had walked away from the car and the accomplice who had cut up the body. And yet, after 15 hours of deliberation, the jury could not agree. 11 of them wanted to convict, 1 held out for acquittal. The result was a hung jury and a mistrial, an outcome that must have been agonizing for Adrian's family, who had to brace themselves to go through the whole thing a second time. The second trial was moved to Dixon, Illinois, because of how heavily the case had been covered in the Quad Cities, and it began on February 6, 2006. This time there was no deadlock. The jury convicted Sarah Kolb on all counts. Her sentence a few months later, she received 48 years in prison for the murder and another 5 years for concealing it, with the 2 terms ordered to run one after the other. A total of 53 years behind bars. She is serving that sentence at the Logan Correctional Center in Illinois. Corey Gregory took a different route. Rather than risk a trial, Corey pleaded guilty to all the charges. On July 10, 2006, Corey was sentenced to 40 years for the murder, plus 5 years for concealment, a total of 45 years, and was sent to prison as well. One note for accuracy. In the years since, Corey Gregory transitioned while incarcerated, and now goes by the name Harley Quinn, using she/her, so coverage of the more recent Attila case refers to her by that name, whichever name the records use. The role in Adrian's death is the same one a jury and a guilty plea established back in 2006. Nathan Godet, the third teenager, the one who took up the saw, was charged as a juvenile because of his age and his more limited role. He pleaded guilty to concealment and was given a 5-year juvenile sentence. He was released from juvenile detention in November of 2008. After serving close to 4 years, his own story ended a few years later. In April of 2012, Nathan Godet died in a car crash in Indiana. He was a young man by then, out in the world, but the thing he had done at 16 had already become one of the most disturbing footnotes in his state's criminal history. The years since have been filled with legal aftershocks, mostly tied to how the courts treat people who committed serious crimes as juveniles. Corey was 17 at the time. Later rulings about juvenile sentencing led to repeated re-sentencing hearings. Through all of it, the 45-year sentence has so far held Sarah too has tried more than once to get her sentence reduced and has sought clemency, arguing that her youth at the time should count for something. Those efforts have not succeeded. Adrian's father, Tony Reynolds, has shown up to those hearings. Year after year, a grieving parent forced to keep reliving the worst thing that ever happened to his family every time one of his daughter's killers asks a court for mercy. This case became national true crime material. It has been retold on Dateline, on a string of cable documentary series, and on more podcasts than anyone could easily count, often under titles that lean on the love triangle angle and the shocking nature of the cover-up. And it is worth pausing on why it grabbed people the way it did, because the answer is unsettling. It was not a sophisticated crime. There was no master plan, no clever scheme, no grand motive. There was a 16-year-old who felt that a new girl was encroaching on her ex-boyfriend, and who decided and wrote down that the new girl had to die for it. Reason was almost a nothing. The aftermath was almost beyond comprehension. That gap between the smallness of the jealousy and the enormity of what was done to a human body to cover it up is exactly what makes this story so hard to shake. And underneath the horror is the same quiet truth that runs through this whole video. Adrian Reynolds had not really done anything. She had moved to a new town, tried to make friends, talked to a boy, and asked him out. The most ordinary things a teenager can do. She wanted a GED and a future in the Marines. She did not know that the boy she liked came attached to a girl who treated him as her possession, and she could not have guessed that her friendliness would be read as a declaration of war. She trusted an invitation to lunch from someone she thought was a friend, got into a car, and never got out. People who ended her life were teenagers themselves. Kids who should have been worried about their GED classes and their weekend plans, and instead chose to do something that will keep them in prison well into old age and keep Adrienne's family grieving forever. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What sets Sarah Kolb's case apart in this lineup is that small group of teenagers calmly working together, choking a girl, trying to burn her, sawing her apart, and stopping for fast food in between, over a jealousy you could fit in a thimble. But it was not the first time a cluster of teenage girls turned a romantic obsession into something monstrous. And it was not even the worst. For that, we have to go back more than a decade earlier to a cold January night in Indiana, where a group of girls, more of them, this time set out after a victim who was younger than any other person in this entire video, over a relationship that most of the adults in their lives never even knew was happening. Section 7. Melinda Loveless. A jealousy that took a child's life. Everything you have heard so far in this video happened to teenagers or young adults. This one is different. And it is the hardest part of the story to sit with, because the person whose life was taken was a child. Her name was Shonda Renee Sharer, and she was 12 years old. To understand how 4 other girls came to do what they did to her on a freezing January night in 1992, you have to start with who Shonda was, because she was, by every account, an ordinary, sweet kid who had done nothing to deserve any of it. Shonda was born in June of 1979. Parents divorced when she was young, and after a couple of moves with her mother, she ended up in New Albany, Indiana, in the summer of 1991. She was the kind of girl who threw herself into the things kids her age do. She had been a cheerleader, she had played volleyball and softball, and after she switched to a Catholic school in New Albany, she joined the girls' basketball team. She was 12. She had braces on her teeth. She was, in other words, exactly what a 12-year-old is supposed to be. A child still figuring out who she was, with her whole life ahead of her. Girl At the centre of what happened to her was Melinda Loveless, who was 16. To make sense of Melinda, you have to understand the home she came out of, not as an excuse for anything, but because it became a central part of the case later on. Melinda grew up in a household defined by extreme and sustained abuse. Father was a violent, predatory man whose cruelty toward his wife and children was so severe that, after the case brought it all into open court, he was himself arrested and charged years later over crimes against children in the family. Melinda spent her childhood surrounded by fear and instability. And by the time she was a teenager, she was deeply troubled, getting into fights, struggling with her mental health, and receiving counselling. That turned her into what she became on its own, but it is part of the record. And it shaped the girl who would become known as the ringleader. 3 other girls would take part. Laurie Tackett was 17, the oldest of the group. She had her own painful history, had dropped out of school, struggled with serious mental health problems, and had developed a fascination with the occult that she liked to perform for the people around her. Rippy was 15. Tony Lawrence was also 15. Both of those younger two had difficult pasts as well, and like Tackett, all 3 had histories of harming themselves. They were, in short, a group of damaged and unstable teenagers. But plenty of teenagers and naives are damaged and unstable without ever hurting anyone. Pulled this particular group toward a child was Melinda Loveless, and the obsession driving her. That obsession was jealousy. And it came down to a single relationship. Melinda had been involved with a girl named Amanda Heverin. Trouble began when Shanda, the 12-year-old, became close with Amanda. 2 of them had become friends at school. And that friendship lit something dangerous in Melinda. She decided that this much younger girl was a rival, someone who had come between her and Amanda, and her jealousy curdled into something far past normal teenage heartache. She began talking about wanting Shanda gone. She made threats out in the open, according to what came out later. Amanda even said she had handed letters containing threats against Shanda to a youth prosecutor, and as far as she knew, nothing was ever done about them. Shanda's own parents grew concerned enough about the situation that they moved her to a different school. The warning signs were there. They were just never taken seriously enough by anyone with the power to stop what was coming. On the night of January 10, 1982, the plan came together. Lawrence, Rippy and Tackett drove from Madison to Melinda's house in New Albany. 2 of those girls had never even met Melinda before that night, and none of the 3 had ever met Shanda when they arrived. Melinda showed them a knife and told them she was going to use it to scare Shanda. Plan was to trick the 12-year-old into leaving her home by telling her that Amanda wanted to see her. They drove to the house where Shanda was staying with her father for the weekend, and 2 of the girls went to the door and said they were friends of Amanda's, and that Amanda was waiting for her. Shanda was hesitant. She told them she had a party and asked them to come back later, around midnight. They agreed and left. To kill the hours in between, the 4 girls crossed the river into Louisville and went to a punk rock show, behaving for all the world like ordinary teenagers out for a night. Then, after midnight, they went back for Shanda. This time, when they pulled up to the house, Melinda hid herself under a blanket in the back seat of the car with the knife while the others went to the door. Shanda's father and stepmother had gone to bed and let her stay up watching television. The girls told her again that Amanda was waiting, tired and trusting. Shanda changed her clothes and got into the car with people she barely knew, believing she was being taken to see her friend. It was the last decision she would ever get to make freely. What followed over the next several hours is genuinely difficult to describe. And I am going to tell you what happened without dwelling on the worst of the details. Because the details are not the point. The cruelty is. Once Shanda was in the car, Melinda sprang up from the back seat and put the blade to her throat. They drove her to an abandoned, ruined building that local kids called the Witch's Castle, a creepy stone shell of a house on an isolated hill. There, they tied her up with rope and tormented her, frightening a child who was already crying and begging to go home. They moved her again to another remote spot in the woods. There, over a stretch of hours, Melinda and Laurie subjected Shanda to a level of violence that is hard to comprehend coming from teenagers. She was attacked with fists, struck, cut with the blade, and choked with a rope. At one point they believed she was gone and put her in the trunk of the car, and then realized she was still alive. Instead of stopping, instead of letting her live, they kept going. For hours, the four of them drove around the dark Indiana countryside, with a dying child in the trunk, stopping in at a friend's house, going on what they treated as a joyride. They were, throughout, chillingly casual about it. And in the end, while Shanda was still alive, they drove to a field off a country road, wrapped her in a blanket, doused her with fuel, and set her alight. Host. When there was doubt about whether she had finally passed, they came back and used the rest of the fuel to make sure. Shanda Shearer, 12 years old, lost her life that way, in a field in the cold, hours after being lured out of her home with a lie about a friend. The detail that has haunted people about this case for more than 30 years is what the girls did next. They did not collapse in horror at what they had done. They drove to a McDonald's and got breakfast. They laughed. Later that day, two of them went and told friends what had happened. Old Fred and gossip. Almost like they were sharing gossip, and even brought Amanda. The girl the whole thing had supposedly been about. To see the evidence in the car, casualness, is almost impossible to process. They had just done the most monstrous thing imaginable to a little girl, and they behaved as though it were nothing. The crime came undone within a single day, and it came undone fast. That same morning, two brothers from a nearby town were driving out to go hunting when they spotted what they first took to be a mannequin lying by the side of the road. When they got closer, they realized to their horror that it was the body of a child. They called the police a little before 11 in the morning. Meanwhile, Shanda's father had woken to find his daughter gone and spent the morning frantically calling around before he and Shanda's mother filed a missing person report. The two pieces had not yet been connected. The unidentified child in the field and the missing girl from New Albany. Proust. What broke the case open was the conscience, or the panic, of the two youngest participants. That evening, around 8:20, Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippey went to the sheriff's office with their parents and gave statements. The accounts were rambling and disjointed, but they identified the victim as Shanda, named the other two girls as best they could, and laid out the main events of the night. Investigators were able to match the body in the field to the missing girl, and dental records confirmed that the burned remains were Shanda Shearer. Very next day, January 12, Melinda Lovelace and Laurie Tackett were arrested. Bulk of the case against them came straight from the statements the two younger girls had given. Prosecutors announced almost immediately that they intended to try all four girls as adults, despite their ages. The case drew national and even international attention, partly because of the unbelievable brutality, and partly because the people responsible were children themselves, aged 15 to 17. To avoid the possibility of capital punishment, all four eventually accepted plea agreements rather than going to trial. The sentences reflected the different roles each had played. Melinda Loveless, widely regarded as the ringleader, and Laurie Tackett, who had carried out much of the violence alongside her, each received 60 years. Hope Rippey was sentenced to 60 years with 10 years suspended, a sentence that was later reduced on appeal to 35 years. Tony Lawrence, who had the smallest role and who had cooperated with investigators, was allowed to plead guilty to a charge of criminal confinement and received a maximum of 20 years. Here is the part that many people find hard to accept. Every single one of those 4 girls is now free. Tony Lawrence was released in late 2000, after about 9 years. Hope Rippey was released in 2006, after 14 years. Laurie Tackett was released in January of 2018. Released, as it happened, on the 26th anniversary of the night Shonda lost her life, after serving close to 26 years, and Melinda Loveless, the one who set the whole thing in motion, was released in September of 2019, also after more than 26 years behind bars. The child they took was 12. The girls who took her have all lived to walk out of prison as grown women. The damage rippled out for decades. Shanda's father, Stephen, never recovered. Mother later said in an interview that he essentially drank himself to death out of grief, and he died in 2005 at the age of 53. The case was turned into best-selling true crime books, was retold on talk shows and documentary series again and again, and has shown up in fictionalized form on major television dramas. It became one of those crimes that people who study these things never stop coming back to, precisely because it is so hard to understand how it could have happened at all. And yet, out of all of that horror came one of the most extraordinary acts you will hear about in this entire video. And it came from the person with the most reason in the world to hate Shanda's mother, Jacques Vaught, eventually did something almost no one could imagine doing. Years after the crime, she donated a service dog named Angel in her late daughter's honour to a program that trained shelter and assistance dogs, and she arranged for that dog to be trained by Melinda Loveless herself in prison. Vaught faced criticism for it, and she understood why people struggled with the choice. But she explained, in her own words, that Shanda was her child and that the decision was hers to make. And that if you never let anything good come out of something terrible, then nothing ever gets better. And that she believed this was what her daughter would have wanted. It does not undo a single thing that was done to Shanda, but stands as a reminder that even in the shadow of the worst thing human beings can do to each other, some people choose mercy anyway. When you strip this case down, the motive at the bottom of it is the same one that runs through this whole video, only here it reached its most senseless extreme. 16-year-old was jealous over a relationship. Person she aimed that jealousy at was a 12-year-old child who had simply become friends with the wrong person. Shanda Shara was not a romantic rival in any real sense. She was a kid. 4 other kids tortured and ended her life over it, then went and got breakfast. There is no version of this where the punishment fits, no sentence long enough, no explanation deep enough to make it sit right. It is just the bottomless gap between a trivial feeling and an unthinkable act, opened wider here than anywhere else in this story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Poot. The next case takes us out of the United States entirely, across the border into Canada, and back to a motive that is almost ordinary by comparison. A teenage girl caught between 2 relationships at once. Rather than choose, she found a much simpler and far darker solution. She let one of the people in love with her take care of the other. What makes her story stand out is just how coldly she used the feelings of the people around her to get exactly what she wanted. Section 8. Monika Sikorski, 2 boyfriends, and a trap in a schoolyard. The last case was chaos, a swarm of damaged teenagers feeding off each other in the dark, doing something so far beyond reason that no sentence could ever balance it. This one is the opposite kind of frightening. There was no frenzy here, no mob, no group whipping itself into a state. There was one teenage girl, thinking clearly, who decided that the cleanest way out of a complicated love life was to have one of the people who loved her quietly remove the other. It happened across the border, in Canada, in a small city in British Columbia, and for nearly 4 years it looked like she had gotten away with it completely. The young woman was Monika Sikorski. Fall of 2008, she was 17 years old, living in Salmon Arm, British Columbia, a quiet community in the interior of the province. By the accounts that came out later, she was not from a broken or deprived home. Judge who eventually sentenced her would go out of her way to point this out, that Sikorski had privileges and opportunities that many young people can only dream of, which is part of what made the whole thing so hard to understand. She was not acting out of poverty or neglect or desperation. She had options. She simply made a series of cold choices that ended a man's life. That man was Tyler Myers. He was 22 years old, 6 years older than the other person in this story. And he was one of 2 people Sikorski was romantically involved with at the same time during that autumn. He was, by every indication, an ordinary young man who had no idea that the girl he was seeing was also seeing someone else, let alone that this tangle was about to cost him everything. Tyler had family who loved him, a mother, Barbara Myers, who would later have to sit through years of court hearings, and a father whose partner would also be drawn into the long aftermath. He was a real person with a future, and he was about to be lured to his death by someone he trusted. The second relationship was the dangerous one. At the same time she was seeing Tyler, Sikorski was also involved with a 16-year-old classmate, a boy her own age, more or less, still in school. So there it was. A 17-year-old girl, a 22-year-old man, and a 16-year-old boy, all knotted together in a situation that any one of them could have walked away from at any moment. People untangle messes like this every day. They break up, they have hard conversations, they move on. What makes this case sit in the pit of your stomach is that Sikorski did not see a breakup as the solution. She saw a killing as the solution. The exact reason has never been fully explained. And that is one of the strangest and most unsettling parts of the whole case. When Sikorski was finally sentenced, the judge described the crime as inexplicable and said the apparent absence of any real motive remained baffling. There was no money involved, no abuse, no long history of conflict that anyone could point to. There was just a girl who, for reasons that never became clear even to the court, decided that Tyler Myers needed to be gone, and who used the boy who loved her as the instrument to do it. The plan she built was simple and brutal in its design. She would use the very tension between her 2 relationships as the bait. Tyler had recently found out that Sikorski had been seeing a 16-year-old on the side, and that was the lure. On November 21, 2008, Sikorski arranged to meet Tyler and led him to Bastion Elementary School in Salmon Arm. The story she gave him was that he would be coming to confront the other boy, the teenager she had been seeing behind his back. Tyler, believing he was walking into a confrontation between himself and a romantic rival, followed her into the schoolyard. He did not know that the rival was already there, waiting in the dark, and that the entire thing was a trap built specifically for him. The 16-year-old was hidden in a stand of trees near the back of the school, and he was armed according to the account at his trial. He had borrowed a rifle from a friend. Sikorsky knew exactly where he was and what he was holding. She walked Tyler into the schoolyard, guided him toward the trees where the boy was concealed, and then she stepped away, leaving him standing alone and exposed in the open. From the cover of the trees, the teenager opened fire. The first shots struck Tyler and knocked him to the ground. Witnesses to the agreed account described him running a few steps before falling forward onto his stomach. He was badly wounded, but he was not gone. What happened next is the detail that turns this from a planned killing into something even colder. Sikorsky and the young gunman both walked up to where Tyler lay, and they saw that he was dying but still alive. Rather than flee, Sikorsky urged the boy to finish it. Her encouragement, he fired again. A final shot delivered to Tyler as he lay on the ground. Tyler Myers was struck 3 times in all and died there of his wounds in a schoolyard, having been walked to that spot by someone he had trusted enough to follow into the dark. There is an important point of fairness to make here, because the record contains 2 slightly different pictures of how calculated Sikorsky's role truly was. At the trial of the young gunman, prosecutors described Sikorsky as the mastermind, the planner who orchestrated the entire ambush. But when Sikorsky herself later pleaded guilty, the agreed statement of facts read in her case painted a somewhat softer version. It stated that she knew it was possible the boy would fire at Tyler to scare him, but that she thought that outcome unlikely. 2 accounts do not fully line up, and the truth of exactly how much she intended sits somewhere that only she truly knows, but the facts that everyone agrees on are damning enough on their own. She lured Tyler to the spot. She knew the boy was hidden there with a weapon. She walked away to let it happen, and when Tyler lay dying, she urged the final shot rather than trying to save him. In the immediate aftermath, the 2 teenagers set about covering their tracks. Day after the killing, they worked to hide evidence of what they had done. And then Sikorsky did something that, in hindsight, says a great deal about how little the whole thing weighed on her. After the killing, her relationship with the 16-year-old fell apart, and she moved on to date Tyler's own best friend. The man she had arranged to have killed was barely in the ground, and she had already folded herself into the life of someone close to him, past. It is the kind of detail that makes people who study these cases shake their heads, because it suggests a person moving through the wreckage she created without the normal weight of conscience slowing her down. For a long time, it worked. Tyler's body was found on a trail next to the elementary school, and the investigation stalled. To the people working the case, it was a baffling killing with no obvious suspect and no clear reason. A young man cut down in a schoolyard for no apparent gain. Tyler's parents were left without answers. The case went cold, and the months stretched into years. The 2 teenagers, who knew exactly what had happened, simply went on living their lives. And it began to look like the truth might stay buried forever. Finally cracked it open was one of the more remarkable investigative techniques used in Canada, sometimes called a Mr. Big operation. Here is how it works in plain terms. Undercover police officers create an elaborate illusion of a powerful criminal organization, then slowly pull a suspect into it, pretending to recruit them. They build trust over time, offer the promise of money and belonging, and eventually convince the target that to rise within the organization, or to be protected by it, they need to prove themselves by being completely honest about their past. The whole thing is a stage play, with officers acting the parts of gangsters, designed to get a suspect to confess of their own free will. That is exactly what was set up around Monica Sikorsky. Officers posed as high-ranking members of a fictional, powerful criminal gang, and convinced her that she was being brought into their world. Believing she was talking to a genuine crime boss whose favor she needed to win, Sikorsky confessed to her role in Tyler's death. She told an undercover officer the whole story. Not only that, she implicated the young gunman as well, and at one point even briefly introduced him to the undercover investigators. Confession she gave to people she thought were criminals became the key that finally unlocked the case. 2012, 4 years after Tyler was killed, both Sikorsky and the now older former teenager were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The two of them faced justice on very different terms, largely because of their ages at the time of the crime. The gunman had been 16 when he fired the weapon, and so he was dealt with under the rules for young offenders. His identity is protected by a publication banned to this day, which is why his name has never been made public. He went to trial and was convicted of first-degree murder, and in 2017 he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. A sentence that reflects how the system treats someone who was a minor at the time, even for the most serious possible charge. Sikorsky's path was different. 17, just barely older. But the court decided she would be sentenced as an adult, which is the reason her name can be reported at all. Case was headed for a month-long trial, and then, on what was supposed to be the very first day of it, in November 2016, she did something nobody expected. She entered a surprise guilty plea to second degree. A few weeks later, in December 2016, more than 50 people packed into a courtroom in Kamloops to watch her be sentenced. She received a life sentence, with no chance to even apply for parole for 7 years. Court also imposed a long weapons prohibition and ordered her to provide a DNA sample to the national database. The sentencing hearing brought out the kind of raw, complicated grief that these crimes leave behind. Sikorsky offered an apology, and the people Tyler left behind responded to it in very different ways. Tyler's mother, Barbara Myers, said she was satisfied with the apology and the outcome, telling reporters that what struck her was that Sikorsky had addressed her personally and expressed what came across as real remorse. She even said she had hugged Sikorsky's mother before the hearing and bore the family no ill will, recognizing that they were good people caught in something terrible too. But not everyone could accept it. The longtime partner of Tyler's late father rejected the apology outright, calling it false, and pointing out that Sikorsky could have come forward days, weeks, or months after the killing and chosen not to. That the sorrow only arrived once she had been caught. The story did not end at sentencing. And for Tyler's family, the hardest part may have been what came afterward, because Sikorsky was assessed as a low risk for future violence. She began moving through the parole system relatively quickly. She was granted day parole in 2021, and by 2023, the Parole Board of Canada granted her full parole, aside from a single minor slip. Missing a curfew one night after having a drink at dinner with a friend, she was reported to have behaved well under supervision. Tyler's family fought these releases at every step. They submitted statements telling the board that letting Sikorsky move on with her life sent the message that Tyler's life had not mattered, while her future did. They asked for restrictions to protect themselves, and the board did impose one, barring Sikorsky from going to Vancouver Island, where members of the family lived, without prior written approval. Imagine that for a moment. A grieving family having to formally request that the person responsible for their son's death be kept away from the place they live. When you set this case beside the others in this video, what stands out is the sheer cold efficiency of it, paired with a motive that never made any sense. There was no abusive childhood driving Sikorsky the way there was for some of the others. There was no jealous rage in the heat of a moment. There was a girl with every advantage, caught in a romantic situation that thousands of teenagers stumble into and resolve without anyone getting hurt, who instead chose to engineer a death. She turned the genuine feelings of a 16-year-old boy into a weapon, pointed him at the man she wanted gone, and then walked away to let it happen, and afterwards stepped neatly into the life of her victim's best friend, as if nothing had occurred. The judge called it inexplicable, and maybe that is the most honest word anyone has ever found for it. Some of these crimes you can trace back to a wound. This one just sits there, blank and chilling, with no real bottom to it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case pulls us right up to the present day, and it could hardly be more different from this one. There is no 4-year mystery, no elaborate plot, no undercover sting. The people involved knew exactly who was responsible from almost the first moment. What turned this one into a genuine question was not who did it, but what it actually was. Because in the end, a court looked at a young woman who ended her boyfriend's life and decided it was not first degree at all, but something the law treats very differently. Section 9. Jahara Malik, the case the law would not call first degree. This case is the most recent one in this video, and in some ways it is the closest of all of them to the simple idea this whole video started with: a relationship that ended, and a young person who did not survive the ending. It happened in Miami, Florida, just before Christmas in 2024. There was no mystery about who was responsible, no years-long investigation, no clever cover story that held up. From almost the first moment, everyone knew who had been holding the blade. The hard question in this case was never who, was what to call it, how the law should treat it, and whether the word the family wanted matched the word the court was willing to use. The young man who lost his life was Yakim Lola, known to the people who loved him as Chemo. He was 17 years old, a junior at Miami Northwestern Senior High School, and by every description that came out of his community, he was the kind of kid a school is lucky to have. He played football for Northwestern, a program with a serious reputation, and he was a strong student on top of it, described by people who knew him as a straight-A student with real ambitions and a genuinely kind heart. When his funeral came, his family and classmates gathered to remember not a statistic, but a bright, talented boy who had been going somewhere. He had a mother, Natalie Jean, who would spend the next year and a half fighting for him in a way no parent should ever have to. The person who ended his life was Jahara Malik. At the time, she was 17 as well. She had only just turned 17, and according to her arrest report, she had no prior record. She was Yakim's girlfriend, though the relationship was described in court as an on-again, off-again one. The kind that breaks up and gets back together and breaks up again. By the time the case reached its conclusion, she was 18. And she would be prosecuted not as a child, but as an adult, which is why her name is public at all. The end came on the night of December 20, 2024, in the parking garage area of the apartment complex where Yakim lived, in the Little Haiti part of Miami. The two of them were together late that night, and they got into an argument, according to what Yakim's mother said. The argument started for a reason that should sound painfully familiar by now. He had told Jahara that he no longer wanted to be in the relationship. He was being honest with her. He had decided he was done, and he said so. In the course of that argument, Jahara wounded him with a knife. The injury was severe, and Yakim Lola lost his life from it. He was 17 years old, and he died over the words a teenager says when a relationship is over. What Jahara told the police that night was that it had been an accident. Her account was that the two of them had been horsing around, what she called horseplay, in the garage, and that the knife had gone in by mistake, a terrible, unintended result of two teenagers messing around. To her credit, and this is a point her own attorney made later, she did not run. She stayed at the scene after Joachim was wounded and tried to provide medical attention to him. That detail would become part of the picture the defense painted. A frightened girl, not a cold killer, who had done something catastrophic and immediately tried to undo it. But the account of innocent horseplay did not survive contact with the evidence. And that is where this case turned. Investigators looked closer. The story Jahara had told began to come apart. Of host. There was surveillance video from the apartment complex, and there was other evidence that pointed away from a playful accident and towards something that happened during a real and serious argument. The single most haunting piece of it came from audio. One of the detectives who responded that night, a Miami police sergeant named Juan Santos, later testified about it in court. He described that you could hear Joachim's own voice captured on audio in those final moments. The voice of a 17-year-old saying his girlfriend's name and telling her not to, pleading with her to stop. That is not the sound of horseplay. That is the sound of a young man who understood too late what was about to happen to him. Case did not move quickly at first, and that delay became its own painful chapter. For more than a month after Joachim lost his life, no charges were filed. To his family, that silence was unbearable. They were not willing to let his death quietly fade into an unsolved file or a closed accident report, so they organized. Joachim's relatives and supporters held repeated demonstrations outside the Miami-Dade State Attorney's office, standing out front and demanding answers and accountability, refusing to let the case be forgotten, that public pressure mattered. It kept the case visible, and eventually the charges came. On January 28, 2025, Jahara Malik was arrested. She was first taken to a juvenile assessment center, but within a few days she was moved into the adult court system in Miami-Dade County and charged as an adult. Judge set her bond at $50,000 and ordered her to wear an ankle monitor. The charge she faced was not first degree. It was a lesser charge that the law uses for a killing that does not meet the legal definition of an intentional, premeditated first degree. Charge sometimes called manslaughter, which covers an unlawful killing carried out without the specific intent that the most serious charge requires. This is the distinction that sits at the very center of Jahara Malik's case, so it is worth slowing down to explain it in plain terms. Under the law, the most serious killing charge generally requires that a person either planned to take a life or acted with the clear intent to do so. The lesser charge applies when a death results from someone's unlawful actions, but without that proven intent to kill. A killing that happened in the heat of a moment, recklessly, rather than as the result of a plan. The first carries the heaviest penalties the system can impose. The second, while still extremely serious, is treated as a step below. That legal line is exactly where Jahara's family and Joachim's family ended up on opposite sides of an unbridgeable gap. People who loved Joachim. What happened in that garage was not a reckless accident, and not a step below anything. They believed, with everything in them, that it was the worst thing one person can do to another. The charge on the paper, the charge the prosecution pursued, and the one the case would ultimately resolve on, was the lesser one, in a development that surprised many people following the case. Jahara did not fight it out at trial. On March 16, 2026, she walked into a Miami-Dade courtroom and pleaded guilty to the manslaughter charge, along with a charge of carrying a concealed weapon. What made it unusual is that she did this without any deal in place. There was no agreement with prosecutors trading her guilty plea for a guaranteed, lighter sentence. She simply admitted her guilt and put her fate entirely in the hands of the judge. The judge, Christine Hernandez, made a point of warning her directly about what that meant. That without a plea agreement, there were no guarantees whatsoever about the sentence she would receive. Jahara accepted that and pleaded guilty anyway. The sentencing hearing took place on May 5, 2026, and it filled a Miami-Dade courtroom with two families sitting on opposite sides of a wound that would never close. Yaquim's relatives, friends and classmates packed the room, many of them wearing shirts bearing his image. One after another, the people who had loved him spoke about his kindness, his talent on the field, his grades, the future that had been stolen from him. Some of them spoke directly to Jahara with a fury that was hard to witness. One of Yaquim's aunts addressed her in the harshest possible terms, calling her a killer and, far worse, the kind of words that only the rawest grief can produce. Yaquim's mother, Natalie Jean, spoke about the son she had lost and what she hoped would happen now. On the other side of the room sat Jahara's own family, who saw a frightened, remorseful teenager facing the rest of her youth behind bars. When it was her turn, Jahara expressed remorse. She admitted fault. She told the court that she thought every day about the damage she had caused, calling herself reckless. The defense had emphasized her struggles with mental health and her age, that she had been a youthful offender, a kid when this happened. Judge Hernandez had to weigh all of it, and what she said in handing down the sentence is revealing. She acknowledged that she believed Jahara was genuinely remorseful, and she acknowledged her youth. She also made clear that the evidence had not convinced her this was a one-time, out-of-now-here accident. Based on what had been presented in court, the judge said she did not believe this was an isolated incident of aggression toward Yaquim, and she did not believe the act had been carried out in an unsophisticated way. Prosecutors, for their part, had pointed to prior violent incidents, moments of aggression toward Yaquim and toward others, that painted a troubling pattern. So even within the framework of the lesser charge, the judge was signalling that she saw something more deliberate here than a tragic slip of the hand during play. The sentence she handed down was 17 years in Florida State Prison, to be followed by 5 years of reporting probation once Jahara is released. The judge also ordered a mental health evaluation. She added a condition that stands out as unusual and pointed. Every year while she is on probation on December 20, the anniversary of the night Yaquim lost his life, Jahara will be required to write a letter acknowledging what happened and reflecting on how it has affected her life. Year after year, on the date itself, she will have to sit down and put on paper what she did and what it cost. For Yaquim's family, the sentence brought a complicated, incomplete kind of relief. Maximum Jahara could have received was 30 years, and the family had wanted that maximum. His mother said afterward that she was glad her son could finally rest in peace, knowing that justice had been served, and she said she hoped that as Jahara went into prison, she would think about the lives she had destroyed and how deeply she had affected everyone left behind. On the other side, Jahara's relatives left the courtroom in tears, and one of her uncles argued bitterly that justice had not been served for his niece at all, that she had been a youthful offender when this happened, that the court had failed to truly account for her age, and that a teenager was being treated too harshly for the worst mistake of a very young life. Both of those things can be true at once, and that is what makes this case sit so uneasily. Bright 17-year-old is gone. and nothing will bring him back. And his family will carry that forever. And at the same time, another 17-year-old made a catastrophic, irreversible choice in a single heated moment, and will spend a huge chunk of her life paying for it. There are no winners in a room like that. There is just loss divided unevenly between two families who will both go home emptier than they were. Phew. When you place this story next to the others in this video, it stands apart in an important way. Almost every other case here involved planning, a lure, a plot, a weapon brought to a chosen place, a jealousy that simmered for days or weeks before it boiled over. This one, at least as the law ultimately defined it, was different. There was no schoolyard ambush, no group of friends recruited in advance, no calendar entry written the day before. There was a relationship that ended, an argument in a garage late at night, and a blade that should never have been there. That is exactly why the court refused to call it murder, and why it landed on the lesser charge instead. The killing was no less final for Yackheim. He is just as gone as anyone else in this video, but the law draws lines between a death that was planned and a death that erupted out of a moment. And in Jahara Malik's case, that line is the whole story. It is also a reminder of where so many of these cases truly begin. Not with monsters, but with the most ordinary heartbreak in the world. Someone said the relationship was over, and instead of walking away to grieve and heal and move on like the overwhelming majority of people do, one person reached for something that could not be taken back. Breakup was real. The grief was real. The blade made it permanent. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 10th and final case is the most recent of all. Still fresh and still working its way through the system as families wait for answers. It returns us one more time to a relationship at the centre of everything, and to a young woman barely out of childhood. But her role in what happened was different from almost everyone else you have heard about. Because she was not the one who delivered the fatal blow. She was something the law treats as its own kind of guilty. The person who helped set it all in motion. Section 10. Gianna Kistenmacher, the hand of one, the fate of all. Before a single word of this final case, one thing has to be said plainly, because it sets this story apart from every other one in this video. Case you have heard until now is settled. People in them confessed, or pleaded guilty, or were convicted by a jury after all the evidence was tested in open court. This last case is none of those things. It is brand new. It happened in the summer of 2025, and as of now nobody involved has stood trial. Everything you are about to hear is what authorities and prosecutors allege people charged are, under the law, and in plain fairness, presumed innocent until that is proven otherwise. So as we go through it, hold on to that. These are accusations, not verdicts, and the courts have not yet had their say. With that firmly in mind, here is what is known. June 24th, 2025, in the small community of Johnsonville, South Carolina, about 45 miles inland from the tourist beaches of Myrtle Beach, a 16-year-old boy named Trey Dean Wright lost his life on a country road. Trey was from the Johnsonville and Scranton area, a kid with a future he had already mapped out in his heart. According to his family, Trey wanted to become a chaplain in the military when he finished school. He wanted to spend his life offering comfort and faith to soldiers. His grandmother said it had even been spoken over him, like a calling, that this was the path he was meant for. He was 16. He had a mother, a grandmother named Catherine Lee, and a 13-year-old little brother. And on a June evening, that future was taken from him in someone's front yard. The young woman at the centre of this case, and the reason it belongs in this video, was Gianna Helene Kistenmacher. She was 17 years old, from Myrtle Beach, and she was Trey's girlfriend. That is the detail that makes this story land the way it does. The person authorities accuse of helping lead Trey to the place where he lost his life was not a stranger and not an enemy. She was, by every account, the girl he was dating. The person a 16-year-old would have trusted more than almost anyone. What was it all about? The picture investigators have painted points back to the same well that nearly every case in this video has drawn from. According to local reporting and authorities, the confrontation that ended Trey's life grew out of an argument over a girl. A tangle of teenage relationships and rivalries, the kind of romantic friction that should never amount to anything more than hurt feelings and gossip. But this time, authorities allege, it became the backdrop for something far worse. This was not a case of one person acting alone. It was a group. 10 teenagers in total would eventually be charged in connection with Trey's death, and prosecutors describe a coordinated setup rather than a sudden, spontaneous fight. Here is how investigators allege it unfolded. The location was a home on North First Neck Road in Johnsonville. According to authorities, the group lured Trey to that spot. The person accused of actually firing the weapon was 19-year-old Devon Scott Raper of Conway, South Carolina. The central allegation against Gianna Kistenmacher is this: that she brought Raper to the scene knowing that he was armed, and knowing, based on things said in her presence, that there was going to be a violent confrontation that could very well end someone's life. In other words, authorities do not claim that Gianna pulled any trigger. They claim she was the one who delivered the armed danger to the doorstep, that she helped set the trap that her own boyfriend walked into. What happened next? Authorities say was captured on video by at least one member of the group, which is part of why the case came together as quickly as it did. The teenagers allegedly taunted Trey, escalated the situation, and staged a verbal confrontation that boiled over into gunfire. Trey was struck in the chest at close range. After the weapon was fired, witnesses on the scene told investigators that the shooter left in a white Mazda, a car they said was being driven by a young woman with 3 male passengers inside. The aftermath on that road was the kind of scene that haunts a community. Trey did not lose his life instantly. He was found lying there, badly wounded, and people who were present said he was screaming and trying to talk. Close friends. One of his 18-year-old Jasmine Lauderback. The confrontation had happened in her family's front yard, rushed to be at his side. She has spoken about trying to keep him calm, telling him that everything was going to be okay because he was still trying to speak. A sheriff's deputy, who arrived, pressed a towel against the wound on his chest, holding pressure, fighting to keep him alive until paramedics could get there. Not enough. Trey Wright died of his injuries, boy who wanted to spend his life bringing people comfort, bled out on a road surrounded by people who could not save him. The investigation moved fast at first. Very next day, June 25, deputies arrested Devon Raper and charged him with murder and with possession of a weapon during a violent crime. But the case did not stop there. And over the following weeks, it grew in a way that stunned the community. June 30, investigators arrested Gianna Kistenmacher and initially charged her with being an accessory before the fact of a felony. The charge for someone accused of helping make a crime happen beforehand, without being the one who carries out the final act. The sheriff's office, in announcing her arrest, noted pointedly that the investigation was ongoing and that more charges and arrests were possible. That turned out to be an enormous understatement. In the weeks that followed, 7 more teenagers were arrested and charged in connection with Trey's death, bringing the total to 9. Alongside Raper and Kistenmacher, the named defendants included 18-year-olds Hunter Kendall and Corinne Belviso and 17-year-old Sydney Kearns, with several of the others being younger minors whose identities were not released because of their ages. There is a detail from the night of the killing that, if the allegations are true, is almost impossible to process. According to Trey's grandmother, Catherine Lee, Gianna Kistenmacher showed up at the hospital that night. Trey's grieving family, who had no idea she was alleged to have played any part in what happened, took her in as the grieving girlfriend. They comforted her. They put their arms around the very person who authorities would later accuse of helping bring the armed man to their boy. Imagine learning, only afterward, that you had spent the worst night of your life consoling someone now accused of helping cause it. That is the kind of wound that does not close. Now comes the part of this case that makes it legally fascinating, and it is the reason Gianna Kistenmacher's situation changed dramatically after her arrest. Not long after she was first charged as an accessory, her charge was upgraded. Florence County Sheriff's Office announced that Kistenmacher, and indeed all of the co-defendants, would face the most serious charge of all: murder. She was not accused of firing the weapon. She was not even accused of being the one who threw the first punch or said the first cruel word. And yet she now faces the same top charge as the young man accused of pulling the trigger. To understand how that is possible, you have to understand a principle in South Carolina law that goes by a chilling little phrase. The hand of one is the hand of all. In simple terms, that doctrine means this. Under South Carolina law, prosecutors do not have to prove which specific person fired the fatal shot in order to hold someone fully responsible for a killing. Instead, they have to show three things about a defendant: that the person was present at the scene, that they knew a crime was being committed, and that they participated in it or contributed to it in some way. All three of those boxes are checked. Then, in the eyes of the law, that person is just as guilty as the one who actually carried out the deadly act. The hand that contributed is treated as the same as the hand that struck. You do not have to fire the weapon to be charged exactly like the person who did. The sheriff overseeing the case, TJ Joy, made clear that he believes all three of those conditions apply to the people charged. Authorities allege that Kistenmacher lured Trey to the scene knowing what was him, that others in the group taunted him and escalated the confrontation, and that together they brought the armed shooter to the location and set the whole thing in motion. Under the hand of one is the hand of all. That alleged teamwork is what allows every one of them to face a murder charge. Worth pausing on how much that single legal idea reshapes this story. In most of the other cases in this video, there was a clear, central figure. The one who planned it, the one who struck the blow, the one whose jealousy or rage drove everything. Here, the law refuses to let anyone hide behind the fact that someone else's finger was on the trigger. If you helped build the trap, you cannot point at the person who sprang it and call yourself innocent. Whether the evidence ultimately proves that Gianna Kistenmacher did what she is accused of is a question only a court can answer. But the charge itself is a powerful statement about how the justice system views the people who allegedly make a killing possible without ever touching the weapon, because the defendants are teenagers. The case has moved through the system in complicated ways. Several of the suspects, including Kistenmacher, were granted bond despite the severity of the charges, a decision that drew concern from people in the community who could not understand how someone facing a murder charge could be released so soon. Kistenmacher was placed on home confinement under strict conditions barred from using social media, and allowed to leave her home only for medical and legal reasons. Prosecutors with the local solicitor's office have been working to have the youngest defendants, including some who are 15 and 16, moved out of Fafley Court and tried as adults, a process called being waived up. Several of the teens have been ordered to undergo mental evaluations. Under South Carolina law, a 17-year-old charged with the most serious categories of felony is already treated as an adult, which is why Kistenmacher's name and face have been made public, while some of the younger defendants remain shielded. That is essentially where the case stands today. It is unfinished. There has been no trial. There have been no convictions. The wheels of the court are still turning slowly, hearing by hearing. While two communities, the one that lost Trey and the ones the defendants come from, wait to see what the evidence will actually show. For Trey's family, the waiting is its own kind of agony. His grandmother, Catherine Lee, has spoken about simply trying to get through each day without him, describing the loss in the rawest terms a grieving grandparent can find, that it rips your heart out of your chest. That she would not wish this pain on anyone, and that her faith is the only thing holding her together. She keeps returning to the dream Trey had, the calling to be a chaplain, the future that was supposed to be his, and she has said she cannot understand how any of this was allowed to happen to him. As the final entry on this list, Trey Wright's case brings us full circle in a way that is hard to ignore. Think back to the very first case in this video. A 15-year-old girl who lured her former boyfriend to a house where others were waiting to take his life, and who walked away facing the same weight of justice as the people who carried it out. Now at the end, here is another teenage girl, accused of luring her boyfriend to a place where an armed person was waiting, and facing the same top charge as the alleged shooter under a law that says, "The hand of one is the hand of all." Across more than 30 years and 10 different stories, from Florida fields to Indiana back roads to a Canadian schoolyard to a South Carolina front yard, the same shape keeps appearing. Relationship goes wrong. Jealousy or rivalry, or wounded pride, or a tangle of teenage hearts that nobody could untie. And instead of the breakup, the argument, the heartbreak that the overwhelming majority of young people survive and grow past, someone decides that another person simply has to be erased. The methods change. The motives are almost always small. The result is always the same. A young life ended, families shattered, and other young people throwing away their own futures over feelings that time would have healed. What makes Trey Wright's story the right one to end on is precisely that it is not over. No neat verdict to tie a bow around, no sentence already handed down, no chapter closed. Somewhere in South Carolina right now, lawyers are filing motions, a family is grieving, and 9 young people are waiting to learn what the rest of their lives will look like. It is a reminder that these are not just old true crime tales pulled from dusty files. They are still happening. They happened last summer. They will, tragically, happen again. Every single one of them began with something that millions of teenagers go through every single day and walk away from intact. The simple, painful, ordinary end of young love. Nearly every one of these 10 stories grew from the same small soil. A breakup, a crush, a jealousy. The kind of heartbreak almost every teenager survives. And yet the people in them reached for something permanent to fix a pain that was always temporary. Over and over the warning was their first. A journal entry the day before. Threat said out loud. A plan shared with friends who treated it as nothing until it became everything. And over. The person targeted had done little or nothing at all. And over these girls were not alone but pulled others in, with the law treating the hand that set it in motion as no less guilty than the hand that struck. There is no single type here either. Some came from real horror at home, others had every advantage in the world. But the last word belongs not to the ones who did this, but to the ones who never got a say. A boy who wanted to be a military chaplain, a football star, a girl who dreamed of the Marines, a 12-year-old who liked basketball, Seth Jackson, Dominic Russo, Sarah Ludman, Colleen Slemmer, Adrian Jones, Adrian Reynolds, Shanda Scherer, Tyler Myers, Yachaim Lolla, Trey Wright. They were not stories, they were people. Not one of them should have lost their life over the simple end of young love. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.